got more here. I would like to start by acknowledging the custodians of this land for the meeting, and also acknowledge their elders, past, present, and emerging too. I hope you don't mind me calling you friends. Some of you have been friends for a while. Most of you I don't know, but please allow me that privilege. I am also privileged to have been invited to come and speak to you. I must apologize to you about my short breath. I have a heavy bout of emphysema, hence the fan, and I'll take breaks here. And I've got some notes.
Hold the microphone up a little bit
And,
again.
yeah. And I've got some notes abnormally to just remind me of a few pointers. Speaking about Palestine, particularly at my age, is a nightmare. It is claimed that a few years ago there was an international competition about who can write most about the elephant. And just 10 minutes before the deadline, somebody came with a big tome and submitted his work. And it was by the title, "The Elephant and the Alps." 5 minutes later, somebody else came with 3 tomes and he said, what have you written about? And he said, well, the role of the elephant in human civilization. Then came a youth full of tomes and tomes and tomes, and they registered it, and they asked him, what have you written about? And he said, I've written about the elephant and the Palestine question. So that was really reflective of how much has been written and said about the Palestinian question. Now, I want to talk about only a small part of the issue, the question of anti-Palestinianism. And probably to squeeze as much as I can within 10-15 minutes, may I just use the technique of asking questions, myself and of you. And if you can think about these questions, maybe we realize why we have a problem. The world had recognized apartheid. I would like to ask, why is it that our politicians here in Australia and everywhere else continue to resist describing Israel as an apartheid state? The claim is that apartheid only relates to South Africa. That was true in the early days. For years now, apartheid has been part and parcel of international law. It is recognized as a global issue that goes beyond boundaries. And there are definitions of what constitutes apartheid. So my question is, why are our politicians, not just in Australia, but including in Australia, but also in the West, the guardians of international law and the so-called world order, why do they continue to resist using that terminology? When Amnesty International and the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem have obviously recognized that. In fact, when 25% of American Jews consider Israel an apartheid state, and they are growing in numbers. Why is it that the Israelis continue to think of themselves as the chosen people? I don't want to go in biblical terms. I have come from a Christian background. I have transcended religion when I was 15, and I hope I'm a better person for it in that respect. But I don't think that any value system in the world, religious or otherwise, accepts that certain people have got precedence over others. This amounts to supremacy to other descriptions that are negated by international law. it was Golda Meir, the first time she was referring to the Holocaust, that after the Holocaust, Jews can do whatever they want. And obviously, that has created a lot of trouble, a lot of problems. Nobody can do whatever they want. We all have to have restraints bound by humanity and global values that binds us together as human beings in our interrelationship. But that takes them to a sense of entitlement. We can do whatever they like, and the world will have to accept that. Why is it that Europe, that had for a while a more advanced position on the Palestinian problem than Australia or the UK or the United States, continue to drag its feet? Like today, Israel does something that is criticized by the European Union, and the following day, the European Union signs a free trade agreement with Israel. Why? Why is it that Germany criticizes Israel for something they have done, and the following day they sell them 6 submarines? Why is it that last week the Dutch foreign minister criticizes Israel over certain activities, but denies that Israel is an apartheid state? All of these things are issues that we need to consider deeply. A very dear and knowledgeable journalist, whom I'm sure you all know, Gideon Levy, had an explanation as to why the world tolerates what's going on. Among other things, he speaks about the buying of politicians. And let me remind you about something that was relevant to us here in Australia. Kevin Rudd went to Israel and brought up the subject of nuclear disarmament. When he came back, he got a visit at Kiribati residence, and with stiff warnings that this is not going to be raised again, and it was not raised again. Why is it that Israel is allowed to have nuclear weapons? We know, it is known, it is established. Why nobody else has? I'm totally for total disarmament, nuclear disarmament all over the world. But as long as we accept that there are exceptions to that rule collapses. And it's every man for himself, and every man will do what they can to protect themselves. Why is it that UN resolutions by the dozens are ignored over a long time, never find the light of day to be implemented? Why? Why do we, deny the application of international law? Why do we deny the ability for the Palestinians to go and request the intervention of the International Criminal Court and the Court of Justice? It's theoretically allowed, but it doesn't happen. Why is it when every time there is a resolution in the Security Council of the United Nations, it is vetoed by the Americans? All of these things need consideration. According to Gideon Levy, he had a lecture recently in Washington, and you'll find it on YouTube, and I strongly recommend that you see it. It is entitled Democracy and Human Rights in Israel. It's a National Press Club, Washington Report on the Middle East. It is a very worthwhile lecture to see. But according to him, there are many reasons. Impact on politicians is one. The other thing, and the most important to his mind, was the fact that the Zionist movement had succeeded in creating a bogey called anti-Semitism. There's no doubt there is anti-Semitism by neo-fascist groups, but they are in the minority. They are not the majority. Most countries of the world have got laws against anti-Semitism, or for that matter, against discrimination. Whether they are applied or not is a separate matter, depends on the whims of this or that government. But this does exist. His view is that the Zionist movement has succeeded in creating a certain consciousness around the world, particularly in the West, that whatever the West criticizes Israel, the Zionist response is anti-Semitism. So you cannot criticize Zionism. There's a conflation of Zionism and Judaism, and hence, including the IHRA, which has been going around in Australia as well as everywhere else in the world, while it is considered a defense against anti-Semitism, in reality is a tool to muzzle the growing movement globally in defense of Palestinian rights. And the only way to stop that is to continue to intimidate. If you are observing what is happening all over the world, in the UK, in the US, many companies have lost businesses and contracts because they refuse to sign a document saying we will not accept BDS, the boycott sanctions thing. Academics, students, and so on and so forth. So it has become a tool of intimidation. It has got to that stage that even the lead author of the IHRA document has distanced himself from that document and said, no, that's not what it was all about. There were 11 examples attached to the document, 7 of which related to Israel. You cannot criticize Israel on anything. You cannot criticize Zionism on anything. According to our friend Gideon Levy, he said, what is happening in Israel is Zionism has become the religion in Israel, not Judaism. Zionism. And the army is the Israeli God. So the whole institution depends on a certain ideological standard whereby Zionism is, with all the mythology related to that have been spread all over the world, and enforcing it by a very powerful army. Friday, the Israeli army shot dead a 15-year-old kid, 3 shots in the head. This has become more and more fashionable after the Palestinian journalist who was shot in the head. Today, actually, is the day which is called the Day of the Flags. Please warn me if I lose the microphone. And thousands upon thousands of extremely right-wing Zionists will be flooding to Jerusalem to get to the Al-Aqsa Mosque and raise the flags in an attempt to demolish, that's their purpose eventually, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and establish the third temple. Is it the third temple, Gideon?
I think so.
Yeah.
I believe so.
So we'll see how this is covered. Our media here is so bad, even the American media has gone ahead, miles ahead of the Australian media, and that includes my ABC. My ABC is becoming less and less my ABC. It has gone more and more and more right-wing under the coalition, and I don't know whether the new government will be able to deal with that. Already there are quite a few characters implanted into the ABC and SBS for that matter, that they are difficult to remove. But we have lost an asset, and it is no longer a trustworthy, to my mind, organizations. We have written to them, comparing their coverage, for example, of what was happening in Palestine with what is happening in the Ukraine. We have written to them, asking them about their coverage of the murder of the Palestinian Abu Akli, the Palestinian journalist who was shot in the head. No response, and we do not expect to hear from them. But at least we let them know that we are aware of what is happening. Now, I have asked all the questions. We need an answer. We need an answer. It is not Zionist money that buys American congressmen. That helps, but it is not that. It is not that Zionists are very smart and intelligent with their propaganda, their Hasbara, their whatever it is. That is true. The real reason is the enablers of Israel. Looking at the enablers of Israel, including Australia, historically. That's where the problem lies. And let me go back to in history. You have all heard of the Balfour Declaration, and everybody criticizes the Balfour Declaration. The British had given the land of a people to a people coming from all over the world, and that was not legal by international law. The British had no right promising Palestine as a Jewish homeland. Everybody talks about that. A lot of books have been written about that. But I'm afraid the real reason is a little more sinister. It was in 1907, and I discussed that with Dr. Slezak. In 1907, Henry Campbell Bannerman, the British Prime Minister, invited 7 foreign ministers from Europe, and they had a meeting in London. The discussion was about colonial interests in the Middle East, and the point of view was the colonial forces will lose all their interests in the Middle East unless they find a mechanism to keep the Middle East divided and at war with itself. The solution was we have to implant a new country right smack bang in the middle of the Middle East that will be totally reliant on the colonial masters for its survival and hence continue to serve our interests. That was 1907. To my mind, that is the father of the Balfour Declaration. And all the talk about the suffering of the Jews, the Holocaust, and poor people, we need to find an estate and so on. This is all secondary. The real truth, which until today is the case, it's not that colonialism had moved into imperialism and imperialism into neocolonialism. I maintain that classical style colonialism is still around us in good health and being very active. And what is happening, this total enabling of Israel goes back to 1907. Israel is doing exactly what the colonial interests of the West wanted to do. Look at it. All wars in the Middle East, all attempts to unite, all attempts to become independent economically and so on and so forth. The Middle East always wanted to have good relations with the West and the East. They were not allowed. They had to choose to their own detriment. And the situation is such that Israel continues to serve colonial interests, let me use that term to make it clear, of the West. That West that are the guardians of international law and also the people who oversee our great world order with all its messes. So all of these things, and I will not go beyond this, harks back to 1907, real politics. And everything else that happens, we have to read it like that. No other way of reading it. There is no way anybody can enable Israel in doing what they are doing without those people having a vested interest in allowing and covering Israel and helping Israel carry on with its project. Now, we have I think it was in 2019 when I first brought the question of IHRA. You're all familiar with IHRA? Yeah? I brought it to the attention of friendly politicians. And I told them that it's very dangerous, and I told them to brace themselves for an onslaught by the Zionist movement in Australia. It is coming. I could see it coming. They said, oh, well, don't worry, we will continue to support Palestine. Now, IHRA is here. And they're going into universities, they're going into municipal councils, and the program, the campaign is growing quickly. On our part, we were surprised by the silence, if not less than silence, by particularly the Labour Party on the question of IHRA. And the Labour Party had always been a close party to ourselves. We had nurtured a relationship with the Labour Party some 50 years ago, and it was all the time growing forward. There were hiccups, but that relationship was successful. Hence, there was a problem here, and it is dividing members of the Labour Party, this issue of the IHRA, opposition to the BDS. And I want to touch upon BDS. It is a fact that when the Palestinian armed struggle started in 1965, it hadn't been mentioned at all as a Palestinian case since 1948. And at first it was denounced by the Western protectors that this is violence and so on and so forth. But then the Palestinian movement went into peaceful struggle. And it is claimed that this started in 1993 after the Gulf War, which is rubbish. It is definitely started in 1974 when Yasser Arafat was in Geneva for the United Nations Convention, in which he declared, I have the weapon of a revolutionary in one hand and an olive branch in another. Don't let me drop the olive branch. And he was saying this on the premise of the negotiations between PLO and America for the Palestinians to move towards international law to resolve this conflict with Israel. Of course, nothing happened. There had been massacre after massacre after massacre, and the place to do it was Lebanon, because the Israelis did not want any improvement of Palestinian-American relationships. At any rate, this is where we are now. We are in a situation whereby the clumsy issue is the international lawyers of the Western countries are telling the Palestinians, you have got to negotiate. You have got to negotiate. 30 years of negotiation and nothing happens. You know, I say, I compare this to a child having a slice of pizza in his hand and a sumo wrestler coming and snatching that slice of pizza and starts trumping. And the kid starts crying, and the guardians of international law come and say, what's going on? And the kid says, you know, he snatched this piece of pizza from my hand. Not you, you shouldn't do that. I tell you what, we put you in this iron cage, both of you, go in, we'll lock you up, we will not let you out until you have negotiated a solution. And the sumo wrestler, of course, continues chomping. This is where we stand. The status quo, Palestine is disappearing. And any concept of a two-state solution has become really impossible. And I must say also that the other point of view of a one-state solution is also a romantic expression. It's very difficult to have two-state solution, but now, in this state of balance of power, to say, let's work for a one-state solution is jumping hoops. When I go to the West Bank to visit, they stop me for 3-4 hours at the border because I happen to be of Palestinian roots or from Jerusalem, let alone the question of the right of return of 6 million Palestinians, which, by the way, the recognition of Israel in 1949 by the United Nations was conditional on the application of the right of return. But that's another matter that's also disposable in overall realm of things. So the one-state solution also is not feasible. It's a romantic ploy. And the reason why I'm saying this is I don't want people to bark up their own tree. We are having tremendous difficulty with the two-state solution. Let's go for a one-state solution. Neither is feasible. What is feasible is a change of balance of power. Without a change of balance of power, nothing is going to happen. Not two states, not one state, and I always beseech all the support groups for Palestine to forget about this redundant argument about two states or one state. The fact of the matter, neither is feasible at this stage of balance of power. What we need to do is to change the balance of power. And hence, because the establishment, the political establishment, political economic establishment of the West will not accept that willingly at this stage, it is up to the people of the West to make that possible by putting pressure on their governments, just as happened in the South African case. That will not be the strategy, but that is one thing that will create and will generate a gradual change in balance of power that may convince, to begin with, Western establishments, political and economic, that we've got to do something about this, otherwise we lose a lot of our influence, and might convince the Israelis that there is no escaping finding a genuine solution to this. At the moment, the majority of Israelis don't need to have a political solution. The status quo is very comfortable for them. Yes, once in a while they send their troops here and there, but the fact of life, they are gobbling land more and more every day. The fact of life is they're gobbling natural resources every day, making life difficult. They're changing the character of the cities, including in Jerusalem, where the names of places have been changed and people don't realize them. So what I'm talking about is an indication to what I would hope supporters of a just peace in the Middle East would go for in terms of pressurizing these governments, these establishments, into saying, let's look at a genuine solution, and the status quo is no longer acceptable. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, let me echo Eddi in acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Aora Nation. That's a pretty pertinent observation because we're also talking about the plight of the indigenous people of Palestine. I'm pleased as the understudy for Bob Carr to be on the same platform as Eddi, whose analysis of the Palestinian situation in every public forum I've ever come across, Eddi, has been thoughtful, penetrating, with a nice historical touch. So it's great to be here this afternoon after last Saturday's election. We meet in the spirit of Alice Beecham, and I want to thank my wonderful friend Frank Stilwell for teaching economics to somebody called Anthony Albanese. Okay, well, I'm probably going to repeat a certain amount of what Eddie said. I'm just going to whip through this absurd reference and propaganda, really, about the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, the International Holocaust Remembrance Association. Okay, that better, sorry. Because there's a massive imbalance between the preoccupation around the world with anti-Semitism and an almost complete ignorance of anti-Palestinianism in some ways, until the publication by the Australian Arab Federation of this first significant document, only 4 pages, on the meaning of anti-Palestinianism. It's weird that the IHRA definition has gathered so much momentum and has been almost taken for granted, I'd have to say, by people who sound to me as though they've never read it. It talks about anti-Semitism as being merely discrimination against people on the basis of being Jews of Israel. As Eddi mentioned, 7 of the 12 points in the IHRA definition are illustrations of what happens to people of Israel. And the rush to adopt it by politicians, in local government, and more recently in universities, occurs despite the very significant criticism of this document all over the place. I mean, Geoffrey Robinson, the barrister, said it was full of misrepresentation, totally confusing, that you couldn't rely on it to analyse anything. The wonderful Jewish American academic Norman Finkelstein said it was a completely slovenly piece of work that contributed nothing to dialogue. The Israeli professor of human rights law at the Hebrew University originally, Neve Gordon, said in the London Review of Books that it was merely there to weaponize anti-Semitism, to stifle any criticism of Israel. And Peter, though he's disappeared to go to the opera, Peter Slezak, that's terrible, Eddie, that he should have done that, reminded me that the very significant American NGO, Americans for Peace, said that that anti-Semitism is merely weaponized via the IHRA definition to stifle free speech. And yet it's being adopted as the gold standard. And Kenneth Stern was the guy who crafted it originally, and he's repeated that he didn't expect it to be the gold standard by which to justify hate speech. So my question to the Vice-Chancellors, respectively, of Melbourne University and Sydney, and I'll tell you why in a minute, why they think that it's a good idea to adopt it, it looks to me as though they haven't read it. But there's a sense in which not much reading seems to go on in universities these days. Certainly not by this phenomenon called management. Now let's deal with the contrast between the concern with anything that looks like anti-Semitism. I mean, the charge of anti-Semitism should be taken seriously, along with Islamophobia, homophobia, any kind of bigotry and discrimination. But you can't use it as a kind of knee-jerk reaction without thinking, in order to avoid the accusation that you didn't say it. I mean, a lot of people are signing this document, adopting it, for fear of the accusation that they didn't adopt it. And I'll come to that. Let's have a look at the business of anti-Palestinianism that gets completely ignored. The brutal occupation of Palestinian lands has been going on really since 1948, 1949. The brutal occupation of the West Bank for over 50 years. We're into the 16th year of the siege of Gaza. I mean, why on earth do people go home after their $250,000 salaries in our nation's capital without much thought about that? Of course, there are some brilliant exceptions, led by the man who looks as though he's going to be the next speaker, and Andrew Wilkie. the anti-Palestinianism is almost incessant. Golda Meir, the first, I thought she was the first prime minister of Israel, said the Palestinians didn't exist. I mean, nothing could be more stigmatizing than to say a people don't exist. They are of no, they're not really human beings. They are of no consequence. The present Prime Minister of Israel, Naftali Bennett, said that I've killed a lot of Palestinian Arabs in my time, and what is wrong with that? Now, if anybody even sniffed those words about one Jewish person, there would be outrage around the globe. And echoing Naftali Bennett, although in some ways he was his teacher, Netanyahu said, you know, over his dead body would there ever be a Palestinian state? So the anti-Palestinianism is daily. I mean, Eddi and I haven't been able to keep up with, in the past few days, how many young Palestinians have been killed. I was in the Gaza Strip just before the March of Return began in March 2018. Over 200 young people were shot dead by Israeli snipers in that March of Return, in that protest, and it's all regarded as of little consequence. Eddi's referred to the murder of Shireen Abu Akleh last week, and that was preceded by the murder of other Palestinian journalists whose murder received almost no attention at all. And then, of course, you get the almost programmed reaction of the Israeli government that it probably wasn't us, it was probably a Palestinian. And then the wise people in Bonn and Westminster and Washington and Canberra take that immediate Israeli denial as plausible. Let me refer now quickly, to bring it home, to a motion by the student union. It's about a month ago, about 3 weeks ago, the Melbourne University Students' Union, who passed a motion about taking the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement seriously, to hinder the Israeli oppression of the people of Palestine. They passed that motion. A few days later, the student union up the road, to their credit, passed a motion urging student activists to take part in commemorating the Nakba, the day of tragedy for the people of Palestine. And in response to those two motions, the respective vice-chancellors of both universities reprimanded the students and said their motions were anti-Semitic. No. It's outrageous. The anti-Semitism is like a virus that the Zionist movement wants to penetrate people's consciousness. Never more so than in a meeting of the State Labour Party at a conference when there was a motion about adopting the IHRA definition, along with about several hundred other motions. And the agreement was, remember this is about 9 months ago, in the run-up to the election, please don't let's cause any trouble. If that becomes visible, we'll lose votes. So it was agreed by the delegates. Admittedly, there were about several hundred of them. Admittedly, it was being done by Zoom. The next thing they know, on the Monday, the conference was on a Saturday. On the Monday, it was reported that the conference had unanimously passed a motion to adopt the IHRA definition, and 95% of the delegates knew nothing about it. By sleight of hand, the son of the former MP for Melbourne Ports, what was his name? Damnable. His son from Enfield South had slipped the motion into a set of motions concerned with Aboriginal welfare and the welfare of people with a disability, and it was to go through. They knew it was to go through on the nod. Nobody else knew about it. I immediately wrote an article about it because and named the people involved. But even for a journal that usually accepts my submissions, and we argued for a week with junior editor supporting me and the senior editor opposing, saying, we don't want to name anybody. We might offend people. You've got to have, eventually I got an ultimatum saying, if you take the names out, you will publish. If you don't take the names out, we won't publish. So this kind of fear of offending that lobby is just awful. But in response to that, let me give credit to my colleagues and good friends in the Australian Arab Federation who produced this document. There are certain highly significant principles in the statement about anti-Palestinianism that should be taken for granted as the assumption that anti-Semitism was all over the place. I mean, the first concerns the rights of Palestinians embedded in the Geneva Conventions and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to their rights to self-determination, their rights to a country of their own, albeit from Eddi's point of view, not to be achieved until this huge power imbalance is addressed. It's also about the rights to be able to remember history, to be able to remember the Nakba. Remember, it's a criminal offence in Israel to mention the Nakba. But when you think that the Nakba is part of a foundation stone, a bit of ironical foundation stone of the State of Israel. There's a plea for the recognition of Palestinian leaders and representatives on international bodies around the world, like UNESCO, for example. There's a plea to please cease this business, this corrosive, evil business of collective punishment, which the Israelis go in for. That's to say, one Palestinian, young Palestinian, let's say on the West Bank, has committed an offence. So in consequence, the whole of the family and the networks of anybody who might be known to him are then punished in terms of their homes being demolished, people evicted and so on. There's a kind of beautiful set of themes that run through the document of which Eddi is one of the architects. And it's very important for us, I think, to remember what the themes, it's about the right to advocate their interests. It's about the right to protest. It's about the right to resist. That's inherent for everybody. If we lose that, as Eddi says, well, there's this huge double standard going on around the world. We're all applauding the resistance, the right to resist of the people of Ukraine, but we dare not say a word about the people of Palestine. So may we build a kind of dawning consciousness and resistance arising from the sort of things that Eddi's been saying and from the detail in this document. And as a non-violent person, I will oppose putting the Vice-Chancellors of Melbourne and Sydney University in the stocks.
Thanks very much, both of you. I'll address these remarks to both of you for dealing with this issue of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which is a very spurious campaign, which is problematic because it presents itself as dealing with anti-Semitism. But anti-Semitism isn't the issue. It's about Palestinians, and that's the double header. And the issue is, I think, the question of anti-Semitism is real, but it's problematic when we deal with it in isolation from all the other racisms we've got arising around the world at this time, with xenophobia, anti-indigenous rights, Islamophobia. All these forms of racism are part of this far-right manifestation, which certainly bleed into the mainstream, as we've seen here in Australia. But I think in response to this very duplicitous campaign, we need a two-header response. On the one hand, responding to this very bad definition of anti-Semitism, which just simply uses it to block any Palestinian voice, or block any criticism of Israel, and have a real proper definition of anti-Semitism. And on the other hand, the anti-Palestinianism statement will challenge the actual agenda. And I think both things are necessary to have it is a good answer to anti-Semitism. We say, you don't want the IHRA, well, we've got another better alternative. I think that's a useful thing to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, look, great point, and no surprise that was made by Vivian, who's a wonderful campaigner for basic decency and human rights. There was, in response to what Vivian said, about 200 Jewish scholars wrote the Jerusalem Declaration of Anti-Semitism, which repeats almost what you say. To say, well, look, every kind of bigotry and discrimination based on race should be eroded, should be addressed. Israel is not exceptional. Please don't make a special case about protecting Israel. That's my recollection of it.
Yes, of course, Vivian, we've discussed this before, and there's no doubt there are two issues here. Actually, there are many issues, but let's summarize them with the Jewish issue and the Palestinian issue. And this has to be taken care of. Where we stood was the Jewish issue needs to be taken up by the Jewish people. That's who the rightful owners of this issue, defense against anti-Semitism, are the Jewish people. They will get the support of the Palestinian, and for that matter, all peace-loving and justice-loving people across the world. They will get that. And there is no doubt in my mind that the majority of the peoples of the world are very sensitive to the issues of anti-Semitism. Yeah. I have no doubt. There are the neo-Nazis and the, of course, but the majority of people are not like that. And it is the same regarding the Palestinians. The Palestinians have got to find. The issue is how can we marry them together to establish a front against the establishment, so to speak. In Australia, poll after poll, 73% of the Australian population voted in favor of Palestinians and Palestinians. 73%, year after year. Yet we cannot translate that into policy of the Australian, successive Australian governments. Let's put it frankly. Why is that? That's another query that we should ask. We need to find the mechanisms of how we can translate people's wishes into policies. And that means, like, when we were speaking about two states versus one state, history goes back in circles. In 1968, the Palestinians proposed a democratic, secular state in Palestine where Jews, Christians, and Muslims would live enjoying equal rights. It was rejected. It was rejected by the Israelis. They had won a war, they felt powerful, no need for them to do it. It was rejected by the West. And it was rejected by the West. They don't want peace. They want another phase of Israel to carry out the work of the 1907 conference. That is why it's not going to happen. And that's why I was insistent that we all together need to change that balance of power, working against our establishments, political, economic, to force them to change their minds. This is the only hope. There's no military solution. There is no two-state solution. There is no one-state solution that will drop out of the sky. It's got to happen through the hard work of the populations of the world. And the only reason why the IHRA was brought about is because the Zionists had realized that the Palestinian cause was gaining ground, particularly in the West and in the United States. The support groups were growing very much, that Israel, the Zionists, felt threatened by this, and they needed to do something to muzzle all those support groups. And that's something that we need to take care of. I just have copies of the statement, anti-Palestine statement, that we published a few months back. It will be distributed to you now. There's also a statement as a result of a public meeting that we had with the community and that made certain resolutions, including fighting back against the IHRA and denouncing, actually, the New South Wales Council, the upper house, the parliament, for having endorsed the IHRA, both major parties. And again, it was passed like many other things. And we were going to fight that. When I mentioned it in 2019, as I said before, I pointed out to our friends, I said, you know, we come from difficult backgrounds. In Australia, politics is a gentle thing. You know. It's a democratic society. There is a way of doing things. No, we didn't have that upbringing. We had very hard upbringing, you know, occupations, regimes that are nasty, imprisonment, going underground, assassinations at times, and so we were trained to accept the difficulties and the challenges. And when I was speaking in 2019 about the IHRA, I said, any law that comes out that is not based on justice is a law designed to be broken by the people. And I said, if that law happens, we're going to break it. And let's get the challenge to a certain level of equity whereby it will become a major issue internally. And this is where we need to go. The IHRA, I was asked, you know, whether, which is more important for me, that Australia recognizes the state of Palestine, or we bury the IHRA in Australia. And my answer is, it would be nice if Australia recognized the state of Palestine. That is a project that I had started in 1975. It's been nearly 47 years in the making. But what is more important than that, because of our background, it's a background of struggle, is that we are allowed in Australia, as well as anywhere else in the world, to continue our struggle without the legal force of the establishment cracking down on us and saying, you know, we'll throw you in prison if you went out on the street. In Germany, 2 weeks ago, a Jewish group, progressive, sought permit from the German government to go out on the street to denounce what happened with Shireen Abu Akleh and to commemorate the Nakba. The German government refused to give them permit. And the reason they gave is that it might stimulate anti-Semitism in Germany. You can see where we're heading. You know, it's, now, eventually, people went out on the street and demonstrated despite the German government. And if it meant clashes with the police, it was going to be clashes with the police.
No other option.
So this is what I'm talking about. Now, we have talked, and we can talk some more, my friends. At the end of the day, we need to get down to a practical issue. How can we all here contribute within our means? And I know we all have restraints and everything. To this fight, you know, how can we make sure that the Palestinian voice is heard? How can we make sure we contribute to the popular opinion in Australia to be respected by our political establishment? How can we make sure we put an end to the IHRA? How can we make sure our relationship with the Jewish community here improves? I was addressing Jewish community here as long as 30 years ago. Yeah.
Okay, so I just wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, Peter.
I'm sorry, but can you explain who the IHRA are? I have missed that, I'm sorry. The IHRA. And can you also tell us what the document is you're referring to that Eddi had something to do with on the table?
This costs $500 each. This.
And you can have two for one, for the last. But the IHRA is the International Holocaust Remembers Remembrance Association. It was started in Austria, I think.
Budapest.
Budapest. Yes. And the original author saw it as a means of helping protect Jews against anti-Semitism. It was hijacked very quickly. Examples of its application were attached to it, 11 of them, which, by the way, are very controversial. So if you Google the IHRA document, more often than not, you will not see the examples. The examples have been disguised and hidden and taken off the website, so that people cannot see the real reason behind the IHRA as Muslim, the pro-Palestine movement. And that's why Mr. Stern, who was the lead author, withdrew and criticized it. This is not what we wrote it about. And other Jewish academics and so on and so forth made statements and came up with alternatives. An alternative was the Jerusalem Declaration, and that's something for our Jewish friends. One of the documents that you will see is a statement from the public meeting, and we spelled it out clearly. We are an organization that's against any form of discrimination, be it anti-Palestinianism, Islamophobia, or anti-Semitism. And I don't want to speak about relationship with Jewish friends here who are here. This had been a long association. But I'm talking about the Jewish community generally. They've got to stop believing that Israel cannot be beaten. And hence, they've got to stop thinking that we don't have to do anything, it's fine. Israel is capable of getting away with it. So why should we worry? So we continue to give support to Israel. It is very important that the Jewish community in Australia wake up to this fact and say, let's extend our arms to everybody else in Australia to fight for a just solution that will be relevant to Jews, to Christians, to Muslims, and let's get done with this eternal issue. It will meet resistance among the Jewish community and with the powers that be, but there is no other solution.
Thanks very much, Eddi. It's come to 5:15. It's time to wind up the formal part of the program. Unless there's someone really wanting to say something more, otherwise I'd encourage you just to come up and see Stuart and Eddi afterwards.
One other comment. What do you think of the Zionist campaign against Jeremy Corbyn in Britain? I think this is a huge, I'm hoping it will be a huge shot in their own foot, because it's so transparent and so reprehensible. Have you got any opinion on that, and maybe what we can do?
Okay, quickly, the questions about the Jeremy Corbyn attacks.
Look, courage in public life is pretty rare, and they were all ducking for cover in order to give an aura of respectability about that leader of the Labour Party. I mean, he was the only Western leader who spoke openly about his support for the Palestinian people. That was the attack on Corbyn, and then we remember 75% of the British media are run by the tabloid industry, Murdoch's tabloid industry. So derision became synonymous with journalism, and Corbyn became a target. And the Labour Party didn't find the courage to speak out about it. They just let the critics within the Labour Party put Corbyn in the stocks and deride him to avoid appearing to support what they said was anti-Semitism. It could have been derided easily, but it was not.
If I may make a quick comment on this. Before Jeremy Corbyn, two members of the Israeli embassy in London were accused of playing games against conservative MPs who were making statements in support of Palestine. They were caught and they were sent outside London, but this is ongoing. It is very professional situation. Jeremy Corbyn was a meteor. He had a view of the world that is not very common among the powers that he doesn't suit them. And to us here, I'm not be saying a secret, we were hoping very much that we would get the Australian Labour Party and the British Labour Party to coordinate a joint effort. And that would have been very important. And hence, Albanese flew to London and met with Jeremy Corbyn. And then there were some discussions and so on and so forth. But then Jeremy Corbyn was massacred, and Anthony Albanese took steps back and made his statements to the Jews, which was unfortunate. I had a lot of respect for Anthony Albanese, but he has really done a lot of damage, and it is going to take a big effort to mend fences with him, and we give him enough time to find his feet again and really sort this issue out. But I do know that he had been very good on Palestine in previous times, and we need to get back to that position. So the importance of that, I'm sorry I'm diverging, think of it this way. Two Anglo-centric nations, part of the Five Eyes, would have broken up with the Five Eyes on the question of Palestine. That is an earthquake politically, if it happened. So they were not going to let it happen. There was bloodshed, sadly.
Okay, there you go. There is a Labour Party policy for recognition of the state of Palestine, so we can do something about that, and you can tell it'll be a struggle. Okay, so thank you very, very much to Eddi and to Stuart once more for your answers to the questions and challenges.
Thank you both.